The Columbia River Treaty. The Columbia River is located in the Pacific Northwest, and its basin comprises of close to 260,000 square miles. Rising from the Rocky Mountains in BC, Canada, through 7 states in the U.S., the Columbia River has the greatest flow of any North American river draining into the Pacific Ocean. The river's heavy flow and relatively steep gradient gives it tremendous potential for the generation of electricity. 1940s. The population living close to the margins of the river had been suffering for years from spring floods caused by rapid melting of snowpacks. The U.S. at the time used to address flood control through storage. However, even though the existing dams built in the U.S. portion of the river aided navigation and energy generation, they did not store substantial amounts of water. Their largest potential storage sites were located in BC. 1948. A flood destroyed the city of Vanport, Oregon. The city was kept underwater for over a month before the river receded. It became clear that an agreement had to be made between U.S. and Canada to take better advantage of the river's resources. 1964. The Columbia River Treaty was signed between the two countries. Canada agreed to build 3 dams on their portion of the river, Mesa, Duncan, and Quinlyside. The province of BC would manage the water storage in the dams for maximum hydropower benefits to the U.S., while the U.S. would build the Libby Dam, which would back water into Canada. The treaty also ensured that Canada was paid a one-time sum of $65 million in exchange for 60 years of guaranteed flood control. Finally, Canada was to receive half of the projected profits of the additional hydropower generated in the U.S. due to the release from the Canadian dams. Throughout the years, the treaty has brought many benefits to both U.S. and Canada. Since the installation of the dams, no major floods have occurred in the basin area. The energy generated by the complex accounts for 44% of U.S.'s total hydroelectricity. The reservoirs provide a constant supply of water, which are used for irrigation of crops. The ability to regulate the depth of water channels along the river allows for 17 million tons of cargo to be transported to and from the Pacific Ocean every year. The river also provided for the development of communities around the basin and their recreation. However, these benefits do not come without drawbacks. Communities had to be displaced and homes and farmlands were flooded for the construction of reservoirs.
I have a long history in the Columbia Basin. In fact, we were one of the residents. My parents and family were flooded out by the Columbia River Treaty dams, in particular the Quinlyside Dam. And I've got actually pictures of the stumps in the water coming up in flooding areas, and what you picture, oh, that's where our home used to be, and now there's so much water.
The basin's community was not consulted or properly compensated for the impact suffered. Changes in river flow conditions modified the natural habitats of the local wildlife. Impacts to fisheries were especially catastrophic. The addition of blockages to the river prevents the local anadromous species to migrate from sea to spawn. In 1973, 8 salmon and 4 steelhead species were listed as endangered. This also hinders the First Nation communities, who not only depend on the available wildlife for their fishing and hunting activities, but also to maintain their cultural rituals and traditions.
And the fact that they're gone now for 70 years has had a very, very drastic impact on my people. Being at 70 years of loss of salmon has, along with that, has gone our ceremonial uses and things like that with salmon.
The treaty possesses no set expiry date. Each of the countries can only amend or terminate the treaty after 60 years of its signature, and to do so, they must provide a 10 years notice. In order to better understand the impacts of the treaty to the basin throughout the years, U.S. and Canada decided to conduct joint technical studies aiming to grasp the future of power and flood control operations after 2024. The U.S. entity developed its recommendations to federal government through a multi-year Columbia River Treaty review, recognizing the treaty must be adaptable to meeting ecosystem-based requirements. It must also aim to minimize adverse impacts to tribes and First Nations, as well as other cultural resources in Canada and United States. Controversially, the review also concluded U.S. must aim to rebalance the power benefits. The Canadian entity presented the Cabinet with its own recommendations. On March 13, 2014, Bill Bennett, Canadian Minister of Energy, announced British Columbia's decision to continue the treaty and seek improvements.
There hasn't been a major flood down in the U.S. On the Columbia system since the dams in Canada were built. What's that worth? How many billion dollars is that worth? What happens at Portland floods?
Canadian entities have developed 14 principles to guide Canada on any future negotiations with the United States. These principles consider not only flood control and hydropower generation, but also climate change and ecosystems, as well as allowing flexibility for both countries to adapt to ever-changing economic, social, and environmental circumstances.